In a scenario where the war in Ukraine settled into a prolonged strategic stalemate, analysts suggest the conflict would gradually shift from rapid territorial maneuver to a slow, grinding contest of systems, logistics, and endurance. Rather than dramatic breakthroughs, the defining feature would be the continuous testing of limits, industrial capacity, manpower sustainability, political cohesion, and the ability to adapt faster than the opposing side. This hypothetical phase would not represent an end to hostilities, but a transformation of their character. In such a situation, front lines would remain relatively stable on maps, yet highly dynamic at the tactical level. Small advances, withdrawals, and localized assaults would occur almost daily, driven by reconnaissance data, drone observations, and fleeting opportunities. Control of a few kilometers of terrain would matter less for symbolism and more for what lay beneath or behind it: supply routes, artillery firing positions, sensor coverage, and defensive depth. Analysts often note that in a stalemate environment, geography becomes a system rather than a place, where even minor elevations or tree lines could influence the effectiveness of surveillance and fire coordination. If this scenario unfolded, the air domain would likely play a restrained but persistent role. Neither side would be expected to achieve uncontested air superiority, leading instead to cautious aircraft usage and heavy reliance on standoff weapons. Air defenses would remain in a constant state of alert, shaping flight patterns and limiting the scale of air operations. This balance would incentivize the increased use of drones, not only for strike missions but for continuous intelligence gathering, electronic probing, and psychological pressure. Over time, the sky would become saturated with unmanned platforms operating at different altitudes, each competing to see without being seen. On the ground, the hypothetical stalemate would elevate artillery and counter-artillery warfare to a central position. Analysts frequently argue that in such conditions, the side that better integrates sensors with firing units gains incremental advantages. Radar systems, acoustic sensors, and drone feeds would be fused to detect firing signatures within seconds. The response would not necessarily be immediate destruction, but disruption, forcing units to relocate, expend ammunition, or operate under constant threat. Over months, this pressure could degrade combat effectiveness even without decisive engagements. Logistics would emerge as one of the most critical, yet least visible, dimensions of this prolonged confrontation. In a stalemate, consumption rates often exceed expectations. Ammunition, spare parts, fuel, and trained personnel would need to flow steadily despite contested supply lines. Analysts suggest that rail hubs, depots, and transport corridors would become strategic focal points, even if strikes against them remained limited or deniable. The ability to repair infrastructure quickly, reroute supplies, and conceal movement would matter as much as the quantity of material available. A prolonged impasse would also reshape command decision-making. Leaders on both sides would face pressure to demonstrate progress without incurring unacceptable losses. This could lead to a pattern of limited offensives designed to test defenses rather than break them. Each probing action would generate data: how fast reserves respond, which units rotate in, where electronic interference intensifies. Over time, this information could accumulate into a clearer picture of systemic strengths and weaknesses, setting conditions for future escalation if political decisions allowed it. From a broader strategic perspective, analysts considered that a stalemate in Ukraine would reverberate far beyond the immediate battlefield. External supporters would reassess timelines, resource commitments, and risk tolerance. Military planners would study the conflict as a living laboratory for modern warfare, extracting lessons on drone integration, air defense saturation, and resilience under sustained pressure. These observations could influence doctrine development and procurement priorities elsewhere, even while the fighting itself remained unresolved. Crucially, such a scenario would not be static in human terms. Civilians near the front would continue to live under uncertainty, adapting to intermittent disruptions rather than full-scale displacement. Information campaigns would intensify, aiming to shape perceptions of endurance and inevitability. Analysts emphasize that in long wars without clear turning points, morale becomes a strategic variable, influenced by narratives as much as by battlefield outcomes. In this hypothetical stalemate, the war in Ukraine would not be defined by a single decisive moment, but by accumulation. Small technical improvements, marginal logistical efficiencies, and incremental tactical adaptations could slowly tilt the balance. Whether that balance would eventually break or remain suspended would depend less on any one battle and more on how long each side could sustain the invisible systems that keep forces functioning under constant strain. If the stalemate persisted, analysts suggest the conflict would increasingly be decided by adaptation cycles rather than raw force. Each side would observe, adjust, and respond in compressed timelines, turning the battlefield into a feedback loop of innovation and countermeasure. What mattered most would not be possessing a single advanced system, but the ability to integrate multiple systems into a coherent operational picture faster than the opponent. In this environment, delays of days or even hours in decision-making could translate into cumulative disadvantages over weeks. One of the most consequential dimensions of this hypothetical phase would be the invisible contest over information. Reconnaissance assets would multiply, but so would efforts to deceive them. Decoy positions, false electromagnetic signatures, and staged movements could be used to manipulate enemy perceptions. Analysts often note that in a sensor-saturated battlespace, seeing more does not always mean understanding more. The side that could distinguish real threats from noise would be better positioned to conserve resources and avoid costly miscalculations. Electronic warfare would likely expand in scope and sophistication. Rather than attempting blanket suppression, forces might focus on localized, time-bound interference designed to create windows of opportunity. If communications were disrupted even briefly during a critical maneuver, coordination could falter. Over time, this could lead commanders to decentralize control further, empowering lower-level units to act on intent rather than direct orders. Such a shift could increase flexibility, but also introduce risks if situational awareness became fragmented. In a prolonged stalemate, the human dimension of command would face growing strain. Rotation cycles would become a strategic concern, as fatigue and experience interacted in complex ways. Veteran units might perform more reliably under pressure, yet prolonged exposure could degrade morale and decision quality. Analysts suggest that maintaining a balance between continuity and renewal would be a persistent challenge, especially in sectors where intensity remained high but movement minimal. Training pipelines, therefore, would be as critical as frontline deployments. The role of precision strike capabilities would also evolve under these conditions. Rather than seeking dramatic effects, strikes might be calibrated to impose friction, damaging repair facilities, disrupting maintenance schedules, or forcing the relocation of support elements. Each action would aim to complicate the opponent's planning horizon. Over months, these small disruptions could accumulate, increasing uncertainty and reducing operational tempo without triggering uncontrolled escalation. Logistical resilience would remain under constant examination. In a static front scenario, predictability could become a vulnerability. Supply patterns, if repeated, might be mapped and anticipated. Analysts argue that variability changing routes, timings, and methods would be essential to avoid attrition through targeted interdiction. This would place additional burdens on planners and drivers alike, as improvisation became a daily requirement rather than an exception. At the same time, industrial factors would loom larger in strategic calculations. A stalemate implies sustained demand, and sustained demand tests production capacity. The ability to scale manufacturing, secure inputs, and manage maintenance cycles would quietly shape what options were available on the battlefield. Even the most capable units would be constrained by what could realistically be supplied over time. In this sense, factories and workshops far from the front would exert as much influence as trenches and firing positions. Psychological pressure would be an ever-present element of this scenario. Without clear breakthroughs, narratives would compete to define meaning in incremental changes. Each localized gain or loss could be amplified or minimized through information channels, influencing domestic and international perceptions. Analysts emphasize that in prolonged conflicts, perception management can affect external support decisions and internal cohesion, making it a strategic front in its own right. If this phase endured, the war's trajectory would become increasingly path-dependent. Early choices about doctrine, logistics, and command culture would shape later possibilities. Adjustments would still be possible, but at rising cost. In such a context, the stalemate would not be merely a pause, but an active process, steadily reshaping the capabilities and constraints of all involved. As the hypothetical stalemate extended deeper into time, analysts suggest the war would increasingly be defined by depth rather than frontage. Defensive systems would no longer be understood only as linear trenches or fortifications, but as layered constructs extending kilometers behind the visible front. In this scenario, the concept of holding ground would evolve into managing depth, how many fallback positions existed, how quickly units could reposition, and how effectively losses could be absorbed without systemic collapse. The battlefield would resemble a compressed chessboard, where pieces rarely advance far, yet every square carried latent significance. In such an environment, defensive engineering would quietly become one of the most decisive factors. Earthworks, hardened shelters, concealed logistics nodes, and redundant command posts would be expanded and refined. Analysts often note that modern firepower makes exposed positions increasingly untenable, pushing forces to operate from protected or semi-underground structures. Over time, this could lead to a form of subterranean warfare, not in the dramatic sense, but through an accumulation of protected spaces designed to reduce vulnerability to surveillance and precision strikes. The operational tempo in this phase would likely oscillate rather than remain constant. Periods of relative calm could be punctuated by sudden spikes of activity, driven by intelligence assessments or political signaling needs. These surges would not necessarily aim for territorial breakthroughs, but for testing reactions, how quickly defenses activated, how reserves moved, and whether command cohesion held under pressure. Analysts suggest that such probing actions serve a dual purpose, applying stress while gathering data for future decision-making. Command and control structures would face increasing complexity as the war's duration imposed new constraints. Communication redundancy would be essential, yet maintaining it would grow more difficult as systems aged and countermeasures evolved. In response, commanders might rely more heavily on pre-planned contingencies and mission-type orders, allowing units to operate semi-autonomously if links were disrupted. This approach could preserve functionality under pressure, but also heighten the risk of misalignment between local actions and broader strategic intent. The hypothetical stalemate would also sharpen the importance of force preservation. With decisive victories elusive, avoiding catastrophic losses would become a priority equal to achieving gains. Analysts argue that this could encourage more conservative tactics, emphasizing defense in depth and calculated attrition over bold maneuvers. However, such restraint carries its own risks. Over time, excessive caution might cede initiative, allowing the opposing side to shape the rhythm of engagements even without advancing. Artillery would remain a constant presence, but its employment might become more discriminating. Rather than sustained barrages, fires could be concentrated into shorter, more precise engagements, synchronized with reconnaissance to maximize effect while minimizing exposure. Counter-battery duels would take on a cat-and-mouse character, with units relocating frequently and relying on camouflage and deception to survive. In this context, survival itself would be a form of success, preserving combat power for future contingencies. Beyond the front lines, strategic depth would be tested in less visible ways. Training facilities, repair hubs, and logistics centers would operate under the assumption of persistent risk, even if direct attacks remained limited. Analysts emphasize that the need to disperse and harden such assets could reduce efficiency, creating a trade-off between protection and throughput. Over months, this friction could subtly constrain operational choices, narrowing the range of feasible actions. The political dimension of this prolonged phase would interact continuously with military realities. Decision-makers would weigh the costs of maintaining the status quo against the risks of escalation. In the absence of clear battlefield resolution, pressure could build to seek leverage through alternative means, whether economic, informational, or diplomatic. Analysts caution, however, that such measures might feed back into military calculations, influencing expectations about endurance and resolve on both sides. Morale, in this scenario, would become a layered phenomenon rather than a single variable. Frontline units might develop a grim professionalism, adapting to routines of risk and survival. Rear area populations and support networks, however, could experience fatigue of a different kind, shaped by uncertainty and the absence of visible progress. Managing these divergent experiences would be a strategic challenge, requiring narratives that justified continued sacrifice without promising imminent resolution. Ultimately, Analysts suggest that a prolonged stalemate would act as a slow filter, rewarding systems and structures that favored sustainability over brilliance. Innovation would still occur, but it would be incremental, focused on survivability and efficiency rather than dramatic transformation. The war's outcome, if altered at all, would hinge on which side better managed this long equilibrium of pressure, uncertainty, and constrained choice. As this hypothetical stalemate stretched toward an uncertain horizon, analysts suggest the defining struggle would increasingly move away from the front line and into the realm of strategic patience. The question would no longer be who could advance faster, but who could endure longer without making irreversible mistakes. In such a scenario, endurance itself would become a weapon, shaped by political cohesion, economic resilience, and the capacity to absorb ambiguity without fracturing internal consensus. One of the most delicate aspects of this phase would be escalation management. With front lines largely stabilized, every major action would carry amplified signaling value. A limited operation, even if tactically modest, could be interpreted as preparation for something larger. Analysts often emphasize that in prolonged conflicts, misinterpretation becomes more dangerous than intent. Decision-makers would therefore operate under constant pressure to calibrate actions precisely, seeking leverage without triggering responses they could not control. This environment would place extraordinary demands on strategic communication. Military moves would be accompanied by narratives designed to frame intent, reassure partners, and deter adversaries. Yet the effectiveness of these narratives would depend on credibility built over time. In a stalemate, repeated claims of progress could lose persuasive power, forcing leaders to rely instead on demonstrations of stability and control. Analysts note that maintaining confidence without promising resolution is one of the hardest tasks in long-duration conflicts. The role of external actors would remain a central variable in this scenario. Support, whether material, financial, or political, would be reassessed continuously against shifting perceptions of risk and return. A stalemate does not freeze external calculations, it complicates them. Planners outside the immediate theater would study trends rather than events, looking for indicators of systemic stress or adaptation. These assessments could influence the pace and character of assistance, subtly shaping the battlefield without altering it dramatically. Within the armed forces themselves, institutional learning would accelerate. Units would refine tactics not for breakthrough, but for efficiency and survivability. Training doctrines might evolve to emphasize small unit autonomy, rapid fortification, and sensor discipline. Analysts suggest that over time, such adaptations could produce forces highly optimized for this specific type of war, yet potentially less flexible for others. The stalemate, in this sense, would act as a shaping force, molding military cultures around its demands. Economic considerations would increasingly intersect with military planning. Sustaining operations without decisive outcomes would require difficult trade-offs, balancing defense needs against broader societal priorities. Analysts caution that these pressures rarely manifest suddenly. Instead, they accumulate quietly, influencing procurement decisions, maintenance standards, and personnel policies. Over time, such adjustments could redefine what acceptable readiness looks like, narrowing the margin for error. The risk of strategic surprise would not disappear in this phase, it would simply change form. Rather than sudden offensives, surprises might emerge from technological shifts, political realignments, or internal disruptions. A new capability introduced quietly, or a sudden change in political will, could alter assumptions that had solidified over months. Analysts argue that the greatest danger in a stalemate is complacency, the belief that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to plan by inertia. Civil-military relations would also be tested. As the conflict persisted without clear resolution, the gap between military timelines and political expectations could widen. Commanders might think in terms of years, while political leaders faced cycles of public opinion measured in months. Managing this divergence would require careful alignment of objectives, ensuring that military actions supported political aims without creating pressures those aims could not sustain. Information environments would remain contested and fragmented. Competing interpretations of the same events would circulate simultaneously, shaping perceptions in different audiences. Analysts note that in prolonged conflicts, truth often becomes less about verification and more about coherence within a chosen narrative. This does not eliminate factual reality, but it complicates its role in decision-making, as leaders must navigate both material constraints and perceptual landscapes. In the final analysis, a prolonged strategic stalemate in Ukraine would not represent stagnation, but transformation under constraint. The war would continue to evolve, slowly and unevenly, driven by adaptation rather than momentum. Its ultimate direction would depend less on singular battles and more on cumulative choices made under pressure, uncertainty, and fatigue. Analysts consistently emphasize that in such scenarios, outcomes are rarely sudden. They emerge gradually, shaped by the interaction of systems, societies, and strategic judgment over time.